Welcome to Next Future Today with your host, Dan Keldsen. Find more episodes at nextfuturetoday.com, on YouTube, or in your favorite podcast app. This is Season 1, Episode 3, and today's episode is an episode for all of you who are caught in an onslaught of collaboration situations of all sizes that, as much as you may love the general idea of collaboration, could well be doing more damage to you and your organization than it's helping. Today's guest is Rob Cross, who for more than 20 years, has studied the underlying networks of effective organizations and the collaborative practices of high performers. Working with more than 300 organizations and reaching thousands of leaders from the front line to the C-suite, he has identified specific ways to cultivate vibrant, effective networks at all levels of an organization and any career stage. Through research and writing, speaking and consulting, and courses and tools, Rob's network strategies are transforming the way people lead, work and live in a hyper-connected world. He has written over 50 articles for Harvard Business Review, Sloan Management Review, California Management Review, Academy of Management Executive and Organizational Dynamics. His work has also been repeatedly featured in venues such as Business Week, Fortune, the Financial Times, Time Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, CIO, Inc., and Fast Company. Today's chat will be about his latest book, Beyond Collaboration. This is another of the few books on collaboration in recent years that is not focused purely on the positive aspects of collaboration, but the serious issues that can arise from over-collaboration, burn out your high performers, and kill team focus and energy. If you haven't listened to the prior interview with Chris Dyer on remote work, that is the only other recent book that comes to mind on not just how to do remote work and collaboration, but to do it well. Let's dive on into it.
So, Rob, this is fascinating. We've been in similar circles for a long time. You've been more dedicated to the topic than I have, specifically for 20 years, maybe
23
longer.
23 years now.
23. You're actually counting.
Longer, yeah.
yeah. And it's I stumbled across your work. I want to say 2005 or so, 2006, something like that. Part of my background, I've done knowledge management work. I was obsessed with network theory and graph theory and why do networks matter, and stumbled across your work and have a massive bookshelf full of material around like the science of how do you make good networks, what makes a bad network, bottlenecks, connectors, all that fun kind of stuff. So I think and given the time that we're in, pandemic, that has changed a lot of the rules on how we even think about what is collaboration, and it's how do we do it when everybody has to be remote, when it was previously a choice potential or not a choice in the past. So you can't rely on the physical skills that we've grown up with. So I think that the timing is really interesting, and as an author myself, I really appreciate books that are written that tell stories, because just hearing purely academic stats or abstracted ideas, I think like that, so I can enjoy that too. But when I'm trying to work with other people and get the message across, being able to talk to them like they're humans and they don't necessarily care as deeply as you do about all the details that you had to slog through, I think that's a huge win. And thankfully, business and academic books seem to be headed in that direction. So thank God, because we might actually make progress here.
Yeah, it was a huge inflection point for me. So I spent the first part of my career really focusing a lot on the analytics and bringing that into organizations at a strategic level, and it had great impact. Right, we had a lot of companies in the consortia kind of following the work and the ideas. But it was about 6 years ago I started leaning very, very heavily into the interview side of things, and I'm personally doing over 200 interviews a year now, where we're looking at certain kinds of things that are happening in these networks and getting the stories and the practices. And so, it has had a huge impact. It seems to resonate with others better, the stories, than the practical advice, the very specific tactics that people are doing. But I also have to say it's changed my life as I've kind of gotten to know, the struggles and what people are dealing with, especially around this idea of overload. You get into conversations with people, and the first 10 or 15 minutes, everybody's learned to put this veneer up, it's all great and everything. And then you get past that and you start really understanding kind of the struggles and challenges, right, that people are legitimately having in today's connected world, right? There's a lot of drivers of that. And so it's gotten very personal as a
Yeah.
product of that. You imagine having 600 conversations that you tend to only have with 4 or 5 people in your life, and it just makes it very real. And that's been kind of a neat thing to come down the latter part of my career on is kind of that deep belief in what we're pushing on.
Right. So the different faces or the veneer that they were talking about when I gave my first presentation on social networking, I think that was probably 2003 or 2004. So it was the same year that LinkedIn was born, and it was a very, very new topic. Facebook didn't exist yet. All these things were totally new, especially in the corporate side. And one of my references, because I have a music background, was Billy Joel's "The Stranger." And we all have a face that we hide away forever. So it's super relevant. And I would pivot onto, so what does that mean? Like for me, I tend to be introverted, so I get my energy in different ways, and extroverts do, which hopefully we can talk about. But so how do you make connections with other people if you're not inclined to just be naturally wired to do that?
Right.
And by realizing that people have different faces, that's to me at least, it was a useful way to think, oh, maybe we can find some common ground that's not sports, because I don't care. Not talk about the weather, because we can look outside and it's the weather. So how can we find real connections, which is sort of how I came to collaboration and connections early on. And it sounds like that's sort of what you found as well.
Very much, and that's kind of, I'll kind of comment on that in 2 different levels. One is, chapter 6 in the book, like the whole focus of the book was around this infinity loop model where what I was first seeing in this work is that the more successful people, the people that I call, they're high performers in their organizations and they're scoring higher on measures of thriving or resilience or other things, they weren't distinguished by the size of their network, but first by the efficiency of it. Right, and so they were able to call back about 18 to 24% of their time by virtue of how they were collaborating. So sometimes people see the title Beyond Collaboration Overload, and they're saying Rob's saying don't go collaborate, and they couldn't be further from the truth. It's just that they're better able to find these efficiencies in targeting their efforts that then frees up time to build connections in a very different way that creates scale. And so to your point, what we've seen in these analytics is you're as likely to see an introvert as an extrovert be well connected in these networks, or somebody that's highly charismatic versus somebody that's low key, and that the real difference is an intentionality in it, and so the neat part for me is we looked at, okay, how do people go spend this time, and what are they doing to build the networks? We would find, for example, that the more successful people were spending about 20 to 25% more time exploring possibilities with others. People in different areas, different capabilities, different geographies. So it wasn't a form of networking, where you're just being social, right? Or you're reaching out because you need help, or you're political. It was a form of networking that explored possibilities, and then when opportunities came by, a client opportunity, a piece of code that needed to be written, whatever, those people that had built that platform had a bigger response. They were able to reach back into that network and produce something of greater substance. And it turns out, to be the second biggest predictor of a high performer we see. So to me, that's really cool, right? That's saying this is not purely access to some informal power structure. There may be some element of that going on, but this is something everybody can do, right? These people are winning because of how they're spending their time. They're producing bigger things, and then simultaneously building a network that brings them things later too. You know what I mean, by virtue of how they reach back. So that's been a really big deal for me anyway, is to start thinking about kind of how and what people are doing today that enables them to scale themselves a little bit differently. Right.
Yeah, and I think it's so one of the early books outside of sort of the academic and science side was that I tapped into to increase my awareness of and ability to network was Never Eat Alone by Keith Ferrazzi. It's a huge bestseller. He's a bit of a maniac. I don't take it to his level for networking. Back in the day, he used to use 2 BlackBerries to handle all of his contacts because one BlackBerry had limited memory, and he couldn't keep track of everybody. So he's a bit of a maniac on that. Seems like he's calmed down, but it gave me what I like about his book. What I like about your book in general, with my last book in 2014. what we should all be aiming for is, give people a foundation so they have some clue why any of this matters, but then also empower them to do something, which is kind of the main driver for this podcast, Next Future Today. I want people to be able to something, you've probably known you should be doing something for quite a while, but until you actually do it, it's not going to make a difference. So what's that next thing that you can do to create your next future right now? You don't wait. You don't have to read another book.
Right.
So I like you have a lot of coaching moments, and you have a ton of checklists. I forget what you call the checklists and other things, but it's really some I call them guardrails. So give people some constraints so they don't feel like, well, networking's important, so I'll network in a totally ineffective way. You need to give people guidance.
Right. Yeah, that was my hope with this, was to also to what I see fairly consistently is, it's interesting with books like Keith's, which is very successful, and he does a great job for what he is propagating. But his style of networking works for like 1% of the population, the kind of really massive network, and not just in terms of performance, but in terms of how we feel about ourselves. You know what I mean?
Right.
And a lot of times you see that. You see these real exemplars. Books are written by major corporate leaders, and it's like, be like me, and that may or may not work, right? And so what I was interested in is seeing, okay, if I look at the common person in all these networks, what's the tactics? And what I found, that I've tried to bring into the book too, to your point, is I don't think the people that are doing well on either side of this loop, either buying time back or ways they're investing that create performance and well-being, usually it's not a really big thing they're doing. It's almost always tied up in being more consistent in the small things. And that was really what I was trying to kind of bring in there with the same idea, that you're mentioning, is to say, here's a step you can take, right? And if you start taking these steps, it's going to build momentum that we see really mattering, especially as we go into this new kind of hybrid form of work that's evolving out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the good and bad of the last year and a half or two has been, so I've done a lot of consulting work in innovation, how to do more innovation, which isn't necessarily a good thing. How to do better innovation is a smarter approach, and to do targeted innovation is even better. But how do you build up some capability? Like, first of all, you need to have a belief that it is possible to change, which is why we're not all Jack Welch or Elon Musk or fill in the blank for whoever your hero is. So how do you, or back in the day when I thought maybe I could be a bodybuilder, that was a brief period in my life, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was a big deal at the time. I was never going to be the next Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? So how can you be healthier is a much better thing, because we can all be healthier. We can't all be the next Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I ended up diving a lot into behavior change, because I like to go down rabbit holes and really scour the earth and hopefully come up at some point and recontribute to the world. But are you familiar with BJ Fogg at all and his Tiny Habits?
No.
So he's I believe he's out of Stanford, and Tiny Habits came out as a book.
I'm sorry. I have. Yeah, I have.
Okay.
This. It's funny. I haven't read it or met, but I've been in places that are comparing ideas to the small habits. So I apologize for that. Yeah, I am.
No worries. Yeah, I read a lot. What can I say? And I happened to meet BJ in a conference in Denmark, of all places. When two guys from the United States on either side of the continent had to fly to Europe to meet in person. But he was just starting that work back in like 2006, 2007. But again, it's sort of how do you break things down into small. There's another book, James Clear, Atomic Habits. How do you build things into little nuggets then you could then expand?
That's really what the strategy is that we have in the consortia right now. So, for example, on the collaborative overload side, we have boiled that down into 25 practices, 8 that are about how people put structure in their world, 9 are about how they manage these identity triggers that lead us to jump when we shouldn't, and then another 8 around behaviors. And what we're finding, what's been amazing to me, having run this group now for over 20 years, is first 10 or 12 years, I would just write white papers and we'd all get together and talk, and that was great. But with the acceleration over the past decade of how much people are processing and how much collaboration they're overwhelmed by, you have to really crystallize things down into small bites. And I have even a little TV studio in the corner of my home now to produce these short videos and, the micrographics and things like that. And but I think it's really important. Like, we're finding the company's abilities to jump on and consume these things that get them down to the small nuggets is a big deal. And the second really big thing that I'm finding is working, particularly around the well-being work, is to embed that micro nugget, if you will, into a relationship. And so we're using tools that kind of start a conversation in those things, and in a very kind of process-oriented approach that we're finding it increases the odds that people do things about this thing they've picked, but it's also forming an authentic connection, which is really important today, as means of promoting retention or, engagement or other things like that. So, but it's been an interesting 5 years, as I've kind of cultivated down these card decks or all these other devices to kind of play around with. How do you make these ideas consumable in an era where people are just so stretched, and so kind of overwhelmed?
Yeah, I just I don't know why I didn't find it earlier, because I have a whole shelf of a bookcase that's dedicated to various cards used for all sorts of different purposes. Because it's a nice portable way to just bring it for workshops or just as a self-assessment tool or whatever. And I didn't know that you had those until about an hour ago. I was looking at the resource that you have. I'm like, oh my God, here's a whole bunch of cards that I probably don't need, but I'm curious.
Yeah, it's amazing, like how when we were face to face, I spent a huge amount of money with the consortium. My deal with the group is we raise money, but we've never touched a penny personally in it. We just allocate it all back out into either direct research or things that companies can do off of it. And so we built these really neat analytical softwares that had people coming through and, indicating, helping, isolate out the 3 or 4 things you need to go do to buy back time. And you could get rater feedback on it, and you could get this into your teams and have the team talking. So I thought it was unbelievably cool, and we spent all our time on it. And then I would do these cards on a whim and take them into these face-to-face sessions, and that's all people wanted. They just wanted to be able to look at this thing, lean back, talk to somebody next to them.
Right.
And then, of course, COVID, came and caused problems. So we've actually, and I'll send you a link to this so you can see, but we've digitized them now. And we have them on this kind of really neat platform that allows people to flip them over, and you can attach a video to it and, other things that just kind of make it, again, more interactive. But it's been interesting to me that what I thought, would have been the really cool thing, because it had the analytics in it and you could bring your team into it, people were more interested in this more engaging process. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Kind of getting down to the content through cards that flip and, other things like that.
Yeah. I mean, there's, I'm sort of, I don't know if I'm concerned. I'm trying to see the positive in all this, because I enjoy using those kinds of tools as well. That's why I started, latching on to them, because it was just so handy. Like for when I was doing a lot of innovation work, which was a lot about trying to find people within your network that were the energizers, the de-energizers, the kinds of things that you're talking about in the book. If I found de-energizers, or to me, there's sort of another category, which is like fence sitters. So they're not actively engaged, they're not actively de-engaged, they're just kind of sitting there, and sometimes they just need an invitation. So I made up some cards that, here, you have a license to innovate. If you thought that your boss didn't want you to innovate because you need to stay focused on your job and be a good minion, here's a literal physical license to innovate, or a license to collaborate, or a license to say no, which might be useful, as it turns out. And that it's funny. I mean, I just sort of whipped that up one night before I went to sleep when I was on the road at a consulting engagement, had them print them out the next day and tried them out, and that it was the same deal. It just...
People loved them, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find like the collaborative overload ones, people will keep them, put them on their desk. And there's no one-time solution to this, right? The world is too dynamic. And so it's a really valuable thing just to kind of whip through and say, okay, what one or two things do I want to think about the next couple of weeks or months, and
Right.
dive down. But one of the best stories I heard was the chief risk officer of one of the world's largest investment bank. We'd done a program for he and ultimately his top 200. And it turned out that he kept these cards on his desk. And whenever anybody came into his office, they had to take a card, and it became a way of getting others to think about how am I not just watching my own time, but I'm not collaborating in a way that drains others. And start to be a little bit more mindful, of it. So it's neat to see the shelf life of some of these things and how and like you say, the device you're using for is around permission, right? It's just this physical thing that can kind of encourage people to do things differently.
Yeah. Yeah, so I wanted on the author front, I'd like to step back for a second.
And now for a quick word from our sponsor, Plexicam.com, the modern solution to eliminate zombie zoom eyes when you're on camera with your team.
Put an end-to-screen stare with Plexicam, a modern and nearly invisible tripod alternative. Mount any webcam you have for perfect eye contact with your audience, and look great because you're always making eye contact. Plexicam assembles in minutes, is portable, and is almost invisible. Attach an LED or ring light to improve your video even more. With versions for every monitor and camera combination, you can use Plexicam with laptops as small as 13 inches to displays as big as 65 inches or more. You can even use your full-size mirrorless camera, like the popular Sony 5000 and 6000 series. Plexicam turns any monitor into a teleprompter alternative without requiring special software or a dedicated screen. Plexicam, the clear choice for great connections. And now, back to the interview.
Beyond Collaboration Overload, and I neglected to hold up the book for people who haven't seen it yet. See how the autofocus pops in? There we go. So I have to say, as someone who's been involved in trying to get collaboration to happen at all, a lot, and that's what I was hired to do as a consultant many times. It's a good title makes you think, right? So you need to jar people out, otherwise, it's just not going to get through the noise. So in some ways, I was slightly offended that it was possible to have collaborative overload, but I know that's true, right? And then knowing your background, is like, well, if Rob is saying this, it's because there's definitely a problem. So let's see what he has to say.
Yeah.
Did you play with other titles about that?
I went so much back and forth on the titles, as you know. You give up control, as an author of the titling ultimately. And at the heart of it, the book is about successful people in today's hyper-connected world. Like, that's the heart of what is studied here through quantitative and then hundreds and hundreds of interviews, is those people that are performing better by their company's benchmarks and happier, right? So they're performing well and sustainable. And we played around with so many different titles, to try to get to that idea, because that's really what I want to convey. And I struggle with, we landed on Beyond Collaboration Overload because it suggests that there's a next step, right? In a way to kind of combat it. And then I'd gotten associated with that term through some HBRs. But it carries the cost of exactly what you said right now. There are a swath of people out there that they see it, and then the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, he's saying don't collaborate. And it's no. I'm not saying that at all. But unfortunately, it's the fallout of that specific phrasing sometimes that kind of hits people there.
Right. Yeah. It's a challenge. Like the best idea is if you don't phrase them or present them in a way they can penetrate the armor, then it could be fantastic
and it
information.
Does, like, on the positive side, there are, if I were to break the world down into two groups of people, right? There's a group that immediately goes, "Holy cow, yes!" Right. Like, I can see the burnout in my organization rising, the stress levels. We're unable to execute, not because we can't get decisions through a hierarchy, but because people are overwhelmed. So there's a huge swath of people that get it immediately and start saying we need to do something. But then there is another swath that I'm always trying to come around the corner and say, no, I'm not advocating for collaboration. I'm just saying, think about how you're doing it.
Right. Yeah. So Slack and Atlassian's tools and whatever is left of whatever IBM has, SharePoint. It's not all evil, apparently.
Right. And email, like, what I find in this game is it's not, generally speaking, as I talk to people, you would find that most organizations, their people are having to navigate across up to 9 different platforms to do their collaborative works, right? And you say that and you're like, holy cow, that can't be. But you start thinking about it, and it's Slack, it's the team collaborative space, it's email, video, some instant messaging application that's separate, maybe a gratitude application. You go down the list of all these things that look cheap that IT has kind of bought as tools to put in. And it's created too great a diversity of these things that creates misalignment. But at the heart of it, it's not so much the tools, it's the culture of use that people kind of develop. And what I would find is with the more efficient collaborators, they wouldn't just look at email, for example, and throw up their hands and say, I can't do anything about all of email, so I'm not even going to try. Right. They would look at it and say, gosh, my team generates 40-50% of the time I'm spending on email, and if we can agree to some norms, so we're not going to send it after 10 o'clock at night. If we have to do it, then we send it on a delay the next morning, so we don't start an always on culture. We're not going to try to write 8-paragraph emails and hide what we want in the 7th. I mean, very kind of basic things that are not that hard. It's just a matter of kind of figuring out how can we get agreement, for example, in that sphere of work that's going to drive down 40% of the demand. You know what I mean? And that's kind of the trick, I think, in most of this is really thinking carefully about what's the right use of these tools and not just foisting kind of, more indiscriminately out there. But definitely not that they're evil, right? It's more the usage that kind of spirals on us, it seems.
Right. Well, I like the caveat. It's not necessarily evil.
Yeah.
It can be used for nefarious purposes. So I mean, so it is funny that so I've done. So I sort of stumbled onto usability and user experience 20-some years ago. 'Cause, most of what I dealt with was enterprise, white-collar worker work, as the kind of stuff that we did when I was at Delphi. And a lot of the systems for employees were just terrible. It didn't matter if they were for finance or for collaboration or whatever. They're the most horrific experiences possible. And if you could get them to work at all, you were happy. So, to be delighted with it to work, that was not going to happen because that was not a thing, right? And then Web 2.0 comes along, and hey, interfaces matter. You can make things sexy and fun and gamification and all sorts of things. But it's way too easy. And I come from I usually say I'm an ex-paranoid security guy. I'm also an ex kind of classically bad IT guy where, you wanted a tool, here's a tool. Have a nice day. And you can't do that because most people are not wired in that way. They need and they deserve some hand-holding. And it's not to baby them, it's to give them guidance. Because for all the collaboration work that I did, to get people to think outside of their, I get measured on my specific box of things that I do. So anytime that I spend away from that in collaborating is essentially bad for me because then it takes away from my time, which you talk about with all the distractions and whatnot. That's kind of at the heart of being overloaded. So I think it might be really useful, and your book is one of the few books I've seen that actually tackles this at all. What are some standards that we can give people to think about for their calendaring or for email? Because that's kind of the two. Absolutely, everybody has those, and they're killing you probably.
Right.
So where do they get started? I'm trying to destroy the demons in there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think one of them, the calendaring idea for me, just as a starting point, it's the core difference I see in this game is people being proactive at putting structure into their lives a little bit differently. So as I went through, for example, when we started into COVID, about 8 weeks in, I was part of a couple of different really big survey efforts from some of these vendors that were targeting thousands of organizations. And we were putting in some standard items, but then they let me include 1 or 2 open-ended question fields right at the end. And so I just said, what's your experience, right? What are you learning from COVID? So we've never seen anything like this, right, as a society. And so normally you do something like that, and it's going out to a bunch of organizations. You may get a page of responses back, right? You get nothing back in those empty, blank, open-ended items. But this time we're getting hundreds of pages back. I mean, literally hundreds, and they were incredibly thoughtful, for that kind of a question, what you would typically, expect. But they took 2 completely different tacks. The first one would be, thank the Lord I don't have my commute anymore, right? I've got 2.5 hours back in my day, sleeping more, eating better, my significant other likes me, I'm talking to my children. Thank the Lord, right? I don't have the commute. And then you'd hear almost the very next one would be completely different. And it would be, oh my gosh, where did my commute go? That was the only time I had to think. I'm working earlier. I can't get anything done. And so it'd be that, feel. And emotionally, you could feel like this coming through these questions. And and really what hit me is for that second group, it's not really the commute. It's that they gave up control of the situation very quickly. Whereas the first group held on to what was important in the situation. And I think at the heart of it, that is one of the really big deals, is that never have we had more ability to shape what we do and who we do it with, but we give that control up, or some of us do, because we've been conditioned to think we need to react immediately, give authority over ourselves away, all these other things. So what I see, is the people that do better, they tend to block some aspect of reflective time, right? And they do it very differently, like what we've just shown with a piece we did with Uber and General Mills is a 2-hour block tends to be optimal in terms of productivity. But what I would also see as I went through the interviews is that people would have very different ways of thinking about how they put structure in that aligned with their rhythm of working. So, I'd get on the interview, and these were all who I was interviewing were people that I analytically could see created the greatest impact in their organizations and took the least amount of time, right? So they were my efficient collaborators, and I wanted to learn, okay, from, you, what are you doing? And so, the first interview I do would say, gosh, I do email, and then I get onto creative work, as an example. And I'd think, okay, that's a good idea. And then I'd get to the next one, and they would say, have you lost your mind? If I start with email, I'll never get off email. Sure. And so, for them, it was, I'm going to think creatively, and I'm going to block email, say, in 3 30-minute blocks through the day. I'm going to communicate to others what I'm doing, so they know when to expect to hear from me. And universally, people would say it's amazing. The world kind of adapts around you if you let it, right? If you start putting in structure that kind of manages to a rhythm that works for you. Right. So we would find that, and that matters to your point on the disruptions way more than we think. We know the act of looking down at a text and back up is as much as a 64-second loss, as we get back up to speed mentally. Right. And if you are distracted to such a degree that you've lost your train of thought, or what the psychologists call a schema, that can be as much as a 23-minute, recovery, some of the studies have shown. So, you add that up, and let's say you let 30, 40 of the small disruptions occur and maybe 2 of the big, that's an hour and a half that's lost. And it is a driver for why we're working earlier in the morning and deeper, into the night amongst other things. So that's one practice, of just kind of putting structure in. Another one we constantly see is that the more efficient collaborators had a far greater tendency to strategically calendar Friday night or Sunday night, usually with a 1-week horizon, where they're thinking about not what's urgent in the week, but they're more thinking about, given where I'm trying to go, what are the interactions I'm trying to build in, right, that will allow me to lean into work that I want to be distinguishing on, or that I value, right, interactions that I value. And so they would tend to look at it weekly, and then oftentimes with around a 2 to 3 month window in mind. And, over time, no week ever worked out, right? Right, always kind of reacted in the moment. But over time, you find these people would kind of be pulled into kinds of work they found more meaningful, right? And so, again, it's another way of structuring the system versus it structuring us out there. So those are 2 thoughts, that kind of line up on that, what we're seeing with those people. And, to your point earlier, none of it's magic. Right, it's just about let's get a toehold into this, and let's start building a momentum, and then over time, what I would really see is that for example, as work kind of evolves for these people, you would find that they were far more likely, the really successful people were far more likely to be thinking about early who are the opinion leaders that are going to be affected by this work. Like if I'm implementing a new technology or driving a new change,
Right.
and not the formal stakeholders, right, but the people that are thick in these networks.
Right.
And then what it really surprised me is they were far more thoughtful about who are the negative opinion leaders. Right? So not necessarily the curmudgeons. I mean, there definitely are de-energizers out there.
Right.
But it could just be simply that people have slightly different performance objectives, right? And they're going to be pulling in a different direction. Right. And they would think much more carefully and early about how do I get them engaged in what we're up to,
Right.
and shape the outcome a little bit. And so they would win over time because they had those people's ideas in, and so sometimes it improved a flaw in the solution,
Right.
and they had their buy-in. And in contrast to the more common modality where people are saying, I'm going to perfect this idea, and then I'm going to win by mandate, right? Because I have mandate to make this happen.
Yeah.
And those are the people that, you find they're spending months trying to prove themselves and their ideas, spending 10 meetings, trying to get things accepted. Whereas the first group that found those opinion leaders early, they're doing it in one meeting, So it really is, it's an entirely different way in many ways of thinking about how are you spending that time that creates scale for you, right, over time. So anyway, that's a couple ideas.
Yeah. No, it's funny. So you call it social ecology, I believe, in sort of mapping out pre-meeting, during meeting, and after meeting is what I'm remembering. And I've used a similar technique. So I tie a lot of the way that I approach things to the crossing the chasm model or diffusions of innovation. Take your pick. So there's different groups that exist for different reasons because we're not all clones of each other, right? So so when I would go in to help companies, and people avoid the curmudgeons because it's not a lot of fun, right? You know who they are, and acknowledging that they exist is a real good idea. And having conversations with them, and here's where I think I kind of feel guilty when I come in as a consultant, and it's definitely harder if you're inside yourself. But as a consultant, I can come and say, "Look, I don't work here. I don't know. I've been told your name is this. Is that even true? And it says here that you do this. Is that true? And what the hell does that mean, by the way?" And so it's easier. So it's easier from an outside perspective for me to disarm people. So like using humor is a common thread for me, and one of your recommendations. So if you can get people to lower their defenses, like I'm not here to make you lose your job or to highlight that nobody likes you or any of those kinds of things. So tell me, if there are things that have probably been broken for 5 or 10 or 20 years or whatever, 5 days, I don't care. Let me know, because, you take it more personally or whatever, but it's probably affecting other people. So I can't help the organization solve any of these issues if we don't know what they are. And it's, it seems, maybe I'm reading too much into my method into what you're recommending, but it seemed like that's what you were talking about.
Yeah, so there's a couple thoughts that I was reflecting on as you were talking. One is the de-energizers. What we tend to see is we're literally, mapping this idea of enthusiasm, right? Who are the people that you interact with and you just walk away a little bit more enthused, or who are the people that you interact with and just manage to take a pretty positive moment and, infuse it with fear or anxiety or, impossibility or things like that.
Right.
And what was intriguing to me, I got into this 23 years ago, literally. It was the very first study we were doing, trying to understand the networks of high performers in this place. And a blue chip consulting firm, the partner stopped me and said, I don't think it's a couple of points of IQ that win the day here, because we get really good talent, and they did. And he said, I think it's people that create enthusiasm, right, around them. And they start to get the partners on board with what they're up to. Their peers help them out and bring them into things. Their teams give greater effort. The client wants to buy more. All that doesn't have to do with being marginally smarter. It's getting scale, by virtue of creating pull in the network. And so that was the kind of cool thing to me about the energizers. Is statistically, it's about 4 times the predictor of a high performer as anything we've seen. And it's, again, not because they're extroverts or charismatic, right? You tend to see both low-key and high-key people do this, very well in places. but it's more in the behaviors, right? And so we've been going behind this for quite some time to see what do the energizers think they're doing, and then what are the energized, in the network say, is going on behaviorally. And that idea of like 2 points really that you're talking to that we see consistently matter. One is energy only gets created when trust is present. Right? Somebody can be as charismatic as ever, but if you either don't think they can do what they're saying, so you don't have kind of trust in their capabilities, or you think they're in it for just themselves, right? So you don't trust in their benevolence or their degree to which they have your interests in mind, you shut out immediately, right? No matter how good they are at kind of painting a picture and everything else.
Right.
And that idea of how do you remove pain points early, like we find that's one of the really rapid ways for people to start to create trust. If leaders are taking over a group or other things like that, it's a really big deal. And then the second, a real common hallmark of these people in the interactions themselves. So a set of behaviors are around, how do you build this platform of trust that allows others to want to get energized, and then a set are kind of in the moment, and we find over and over and over again that humor, and in particular self-deprecating humor, right? Things that kind of take us out of the fray, just lets people relax a little bit, you know what I mean, and take status out of the situation. You're being vulnerable makes them say, okay, it's okay to be vulnerable, and it does a lot of super positive things. So that's been the awesome thing, in that piece of work is it's tied up in behaviors, and the key to it, and the tie to me of the overload side is what we see is that most people do these behaviors. What you're looking for is which one or two do you let slip when you get under stress or pressure.
Oh, yeah, right.
Which one or two do you want to do more systematically? And of course, the very first thing that most of us stop doing at work or at home is coming into situations and thinking about how do I create energy in others around this when they're overwhelmed. Right, so if you allow collaborative overload to redline you, both the volume and, to your point, the diversity of the demands, you don't come into situations thinking like that. You come in firefighting, you come in narrow, and that's where we see people falter. It's not that overload gets them fired per se, but it's that they stop interacting in ways that get scale, out of the network over time. So again, that's kind of the fidelity, those two sides of the loop there.
Right. Yeah. No. And I remember reading the story about the partner stopping you and pacing you essentially.
Yeah, it was funny because I'm not going to mention the name of the company, but it is a company that is well known for thinking they're very smart.
Yeah.
And so there was a little bit of a hallway moment when this person standing over me saying, we're all smart here.
Right.
And I'm just saying, yep, fine, whatever.
I don't know what this is about.
Yeah. But then it turned into one of those moments that you didn't see coming, but, predicted everything over the next 20 years in terms of kind of positive outcomes. So it's funny how some of this stuff, evolves.
Well, I think that's so. Just to switch back to networking for a second. So I think part of what you're talking about is serendipity, and how do you create, echo chambers tend to be bad. I always forget who the quote's from, but it's somebody like from the era of Jack Welch. If 8 of us all agree here, 7 of us are unnecessary, or 6, right? So you need at least 2 people. But and that's certainly dangerous in innovation purposes. Typically innovation. Well, one of the cheat cards for innovation is to take an idea from another industry or another role or something like that and port it into a new situation. And there, it seems like an innovation. Somewhere else, it could be a 60, 100-year-old idea. And people think you're a genius, which is part of the reason I do it. But it's just so much more effective to have a diverse set of skills or people or backgrounds or industries or whatever it happens to be. And, that interaction turns out it kicked off, a lot of the last 20 years of your life. So.
Yeah, it's, I said this in the book launch, but I could not turn 2 pages in that book without being reminded of a conversation with somebody. You know what I mean? It's just been a joy of being part of this consortia and the way we run it, very organically and kind of exploring versus trying to do studies every 6 months that come back with God's truth. And it's just changed, everything out there. But it's interesting, we see analytically from places that are doing kind of the network analytics on passive data behind the scenes. What they're generally seeing through the pandemic is that we're losing those bridging ties, right? In most places, like groups are focusing inward, and they're overwhelmed, even with that,
Right.
and they're losing the kind of cross-unit connections, cross-geography connections, things like that tend to be huge spurs of innovation. So that'll be a challenge. But then I also heard some really cool stories, as I went. Like one I'll never forget is there was this investment banker, running a group of, I think it was about 40 or 50 or something like that. And as he went into the pandemic, they didn't have the serendipitous moments, like you were talking about. People weren't bumping into each other. He couldn't see them on the floor,
Right.
and kind of talk to people. And his wife, in this case, convinced him to do something called the Friday Rose. And so what that was is he sent an email to his group. And again, I think it was 40, 50, or maybe it was 20 leaders. I can't remember exactly.
Sure.
But the stem of the rose was, here's what I learned this week. This is my growth kind of thing this week. The flower was, here's what's cool that happened, right? A positive thing. And the thorn is, here's what I messed up, right? Here's what I wish I'd done differently. And so you got to imagine, we're in a really tough investment banking crowd. And he said, Rob, I hit the button on that thing. I could feel people laughing at me. What is this guy up to? And
Right.
then but he said, no, you all have to do it too. You have to add on to this, right? And kind of snowball it. And I think there was 20 leaders that were a part of this or something like that. But basically it took an hour probably for everybody to respond off of that. And he said by the third or fourth week, it became just a habit that everybody was doing. But he said the real key to it was it created serendipitous interactions.
Sure.
In kind of a manufactured way. Like suddenly people were saying, oh, you're doing that with this client, I'm doing this. What if we combine these ideas? Actually far more robustly than when they were just looking at each other in the open floor.
Right.
They were kind of able to see it. And then he also said that thorn, he felt had a huge impact on creating trust in the group. Just kind of saying it's okay. You know what I mean? To kind of admit, one or two small, errors or mistakes. So I think that's where we're going with a lot of this is people, they're going to have to be far, far more intentional about what they're trying to accomplish in the collaboration. If it's serendipity, that's one thing. If it's trust, that may be another. And then intentional about the way you're getting there, right? Too often we just, as we were talking about earlier, you throw the tools at it and kind of hope. And I think that's going to be, that's got to stop, right? That's not working well for us as a strategy right now.
Right. Yeah, I think it's, so I don't love these, but, writing governance documents, something that provides you any sort of guidance at all is incredibly helpful. And it does, so I typically wear T-shirts that have sayings that I think are relevant to whoever I'm interviewing. So Fear is the Mind Killer comes from Dune. Which the new version is out this month. So I might go into a movie theater for the first time in nearly 2 years. But
no kidding.
But that overwhelm. It's not just it's not a fire hose. It's multiple fire hoses that really there's apparently infinite water behind and varying amounts of pressure. Explicitly giving guidance is such a rare thing in my experience, and from an organizational standpoint, let alone your boss or somebody in a management sort of role. And that's just giving giving some hope that there's a way to do this that can that is going to lessen the pain, because otherwise it's all too easy. We're wired for fight or flight, among other things, right? And if you're going to have to hunker down to survive, there's plenty of people that have been worried about losing their jobs during the pandemic, and a lot of industries that are totally decimated. So it's understandable, under that pressure cooker, that you feel like you have to over deliver, that you have to, really work 24 hours a day, and if you don't respond immediately, things like that. I found it really heartening that there was actually we didn't talk about it as much as I was hoping to, but the energy side of this, how do you create structures and guidance so that you can give people energy is
I think it's far more than we think, and that's kind of, again, the structure of the book is to say, once you create some space, First of all, you have more space than you realize, right? But the trick is not to look for the big thing, but the myriad small that we just go through every day and we forget, right? That this is where all this time is going. And so using your calendar, email, or other devices to help see that. But then, what I find, and I really kind of focused heavily on that in Chapter 8, and it'll be the source of my next book, is the people that are happier and kind of just living life, a little bit more on their terms. They find ways to infuse the smaller moments with greater purpose in connections. So one of my, favorite stories was this very successful executive that was a runner, and she had run marathons and 10Ks with always looking for their next PR, personal best and everything.
Yeah.
and at one moment she realized this isn't fulfilling me. And she kind of stepped back and said, I'm going to start running with my child, her friend, and that child's parent, right? And it was the same thing, right? You're getting exercise, but rather than pursuing society's definition, she was pulling herself authentically into a couple of different kinds of connections that created greater dimensionality, greater meaning, right, to her. And I think it's very common, right? I come across these interviews as I went, and I came to call them my 10 percenters, where about 1 in 10 of all these people that were successful, like I didn't get to them unless they were considered by their organization some of the top performing women and men.
Right.
But you get about 1 in 10 that were living life much more on their terms. And that was kind of what they were doing. It was all in the small moments and being more intentional about them versus thinking the big moment's going to solve it. You know what I mean? And kind of looking over the horizon. So maybe at some other point we can kind of delve into that that work as well.
Yeah. Well, are you targeting a certain date, year, decade for the next book?
We just signed it almost the day that last book came out.
Oh, no kidding.
Because it's a natural progression. The last book is very much geared around high performers and a little kind of foray into this well-being side in Chapter 8, the one I just finished. And then this one is much more around what do we see about happier people? Like if you look at kind of these demanding times, kind of what are they doing? And that means leaning into the positives, like I'm talking about, looking at the interactions differently. But the biggest thing we saw in this was that we all experience what I've come to call micro stresses far more today than ever in our life in history that I think of anyway. And that, these are all small touch points that get at us through connections and various media we have. But it creates these small moments of stress where you see a colleague that needs maybe be misaligned with you, or you see a teammate that needs to be coached, or you get a text from a child that you can't tell if they're in trouble or whatever. You work 3 hours, they were over it in 2 minutes. But we get hit with 25, 30 of these through the day, and we go home exhausted, but we can't quite put our finger on what just happened. So it's a form of stress that's not the nasty boss, right, or the toxic leader or demanding client, things that we could kind of point to. And we've got to get better at managing that, right, and seeing that. And so that's kind of the idea, is how do you think about well-being, not as a product purely of meditation or mindfulness. All that's really important, but it's not helping you adapt the system you've allowed to build around you, right? And so we're trying to think a little bit about that, like how do you shape the negative impacts, and then how do you kind of lean into the positives. So
awesome. All right.
Yeah.
Well, good timing. Let's wrap up on that, because that's we can give everybody some hope on. I think there's tons of very useful advice in the current book, Beyond Collaboration Overload. I love the stories. It makes it so much more interesting to read and relatable from my perspective. I can geek out with a whole lot of stuff and get deep in the weeds, but it's refreshing when it's consumable, and I can actually potentially recommend it to my wife or to my kids who are taking college classes. So they might actually read it. They're finally reading my book, and it's been 7 years.
Good deal.
But let's stay in touch on the next book. I'm very interested in hearing how that's going. If there's anything I can do to help, always happy to do that. And I hope sometime soon, we're probably about 20 miles away from each other right now, we can actually meet in person and talk further.
And good cup of coffee. Yeah.
There you go.
That'd be awesome, Dan. That'd be awesome. I appreciate the chance to talk about this with you today.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Thanks so much, Rob. And hopefully this is not the first time that we're talking.
Good. Sounds great. All righty.
All right,
Thank you.
Thanks.